Hi, I'm Christina Pashton with the Pulitzer Center in Crisis Reporting. Today I'm speaking with Jen Marlowe, the director of Rebuilding Hope, a documentary on southern Sudan. So let me first ask you, can you tell us a little bit about the documentary?
Sure. Rebuilding Hope follows three Sudanese-American young men from the group known as the Lost Boys, and it follows them on their first homecoming trip to Sudan, which was in 2007, after they had fled 20 years prior when they were tiny kids. They had fled the Civil War. They had survived the trek across South Sudan and grew up most of their lives in refugee camps, first in Ethiopia, then in Kenya. In 2001, they were part of the group that became known as the Lost Boys, who were offered resettlement here in the United States. And since that time, they had been trying to find a way to get back to Sudan because they had no idea what happened to their families, what happened to their villages. And also, all three of them wanted to answer a question of what were the needs of their people at home, what needs did their community have, and how could they, through the education and the opportunities they had gotten in their life, both in the refugee camps and then in the U.S., how could they help bring development? And in the case of these three young men, they focused on healthcare and education projects. So the film documents all of that. It documents their quest to try to get a school built, wells drilled, to get a clinic off the ground with bringing medical supplies. But then the film also is trying to support those projects. So it was very much done collaboratively. The three young men in the film and I approached it as a team and approached the film as part of that larger goal of helping to bring healthcare and education to these villages in South Sudan.
What are some of the big things that you and the Lost Boys discovered along this journey?
There were a lot of discoveries, and on different levels. There was the level of personal discovery, where for these young men trying to find their families, discovering whether or not their parents, their siblings had survived the Civil War, finding out what had happened to their villages and their communities. So there was a great deal of personal discovery that happened. And then there was also the political discovery. When we went back in 2007, it was about 2 years after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which had ended the South-North Sudan Civil War. So there were huge questions, and there still remain to be huge questions about whether the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was leading the country towards stability, peace, and development, or whether South Sudan was on a slow slide back towards civil war. So there was that level of discovery as well, what the situation was on the ground in the South. And then the realization that there was so much need in terms of development, infrastructure, the very basic elements of healthcare and education just weren't in place. And so I think all three young men discovered that their projects were going to have to be a lot bigger and broader than they had ever imagined. What it takes to actually build a school is enormous, and then what it takes to actually provide an education is so much more enormous, because you can build a school, but if you don't have teachers with training and you don't have materials, books, if you don't have students, because girls have to walk for 3 hours to the river to bring water to their families so they're not able to go to school, then the building itself doesn't have much meaning. So I think a lot of the discovery was how big the job is, but how important it is.
And you just recently returned to Sudan to do some reporting on the aftermath of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. What did you find in this last trip you took?
It was very interesting. I was in Sudan in January, this past January 2010, and this was my fourth trip there. And this trip, more than ever, it became very apparent that the South is heading towards secession. And that in 2011, when Southerners are supposed to have a referendum, and that referendum, through the referendum, they're supposed to determine whether the South remains part of a united new Sudan or whether they break away and become independent. And the trend that I saw all along showed that Southerners were leaning towards the referendum going towards separation. But this trip, more than ever, it seemed almost a foregone conclusion. And in fact, when people were talking about the upcoming elections that were happening, well, they're happening now. At that time, it was still a few months away. They were very excited to talk about who they wanted to vote for on the local level. They were talking about the candidates for governor, the local candidates, but they were actually not interested at all in talking about the national level of elections, because it was as if they had already jumped ahead to the referendum and had already made the decision that the South was going to separate.
And if that does happen and the South succeeds, what do you envision will happen, or what challenges will they face?
Well, I think the huge question under all of this is whether the secession, first of all, whether the referendum will be permitted to take place. And then if it does and separation is indeed voted for, whether that separation can happen peacefully, whether the transition to an independent South Sudan will essentially mean a return to civil war. Because, of course, if the South goes, the oil goes with it. And whether the North is going to peacefully allow the South to secede and take its oil with it, that's been the looming question all along, whether or not this means a re-outbreak of what will be very brutal brutal warfare if it does break out again.
Do you plan on doing any updates to your documentary in the next few years?
Absolutely. For me, this is a long-term commitment. This is not about making a film and then walking away. I've been back since the film was completed, or the shooting for the film was completed. I've been back 3 times following the young men and following their projects. And as long as I am able to, I intend to keep going back and keep updating not only the projects, but looking at the whole situation in South Sudan, because of course these issues of peace and development and stability are all interrelated.
And having worked as a journalist in Southern Sudan, what kind of obstacles did you face personally, and what recommendations do you have for other American journalists traveling to the country?
I think the first recommendation I would have is make sure you're going with friends who are from that community and from that culture, because there is no way I could have had access to the people that I had access to and the moments if I wasn't working in partnership with these 3 young men who I was following. I don't speak the language. I don't speak Dinka. I mean, yes, one recommendation for any place is learn the language where you're going, but in times where that might be impractical, I think you have to be working in solidarity with the community. At least that's always been my approach, and I think that's the only way I've been able to do what I've been able to do with Rebuilding Hope.
So how did your collaboration with the Pulitzer Center help?
It helped in many ways and on many different levels. First of all, there's always the financial reality, the money you need to raise to be able to go out, film, cover this kind of story. So the actual travel grant itself was huge. I don't know how I would have managed without that. But even more than that, the support that the Pulitzer Center provided to get the story out there in all different kinds of ways, everything from sponsoring tonight's screening to having sponsored a screening of The Rough Cut when it was still in formation, to helping me place articles when I got articles, wrote articles to get them out there. I mean, every step of the way, I felt like I had the support of this organization behind me with people who cared about the things I care about, in terms of the belief that these voices being heard is of critical importance.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jen.
Thank you. It's great to be here.